Hello there, you're watching the Press Preview, our first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. Over the next half an hour, we're going to be seeing what's making the headlines with the editor of politics.co.uk, Ian Dunt, and the political editor of the Sunday Express, Camilla Tominey. So a very good evening to both of you.
Thank you.
So let's take a look then at what's on those front pages. And the Financial Times says that one of the most important units of the worldwide financial group Goldman Sachs performed badly at the end of last year, dragging down the group's overall revenue. According to the Daily Telegraph, Theresa May has agreed to pay £44 million to help pay for French police to maintain the border at the Channel ports. The Daily Star says that the death of former international footballer Gary Speed has been linked to possible sex abuse. The Eye leads on claims that a nasty surprise is in store for the pensions of higher earners. The Times focuses on a warning from the government spending watchdog that billions of pounds extra are being spent on hospitals and schools because of private finance deals. And that story also makes the front of The Guardian. So let's get stuck into some of those stories with Ian Dunt and Camilla Tominey. And you've actually picked out an inside page to kick off with because it gets us up to date with where the Karelian debacle, you could call it, takes us today. This is Inside the Express, and they focus on the fact that some of the bonuses paid to the executives, which has caused some controversy over the last few days, have now been stopped.
Yeah, indeed, which is more of a political move than it is a meaningful economic move, of course, because the kind of sums that we're talking about in this thing are so vast and will go on for so long that, of course, this is a drop in the ocean. But you start looking, you know, at the kind of money that's been paying out here, 1.5 million to the former chief executive. This is, of course, something that Labour's been focusing on quite ferociously. And so this was done as a kind of sacrifice that you need to try and get the PR into a better place. Of course, the details of how this operates and what happens now make this kind of stuff fairly superficial and quite theatrical.
But it's quite symbolic, isn't it, given that many workers are worried about their jobs and then they see bosses carrying on being paid despite the company collapsing at
Also,
their
bosses
hands.
who had lost their jobs last summer still being paid. And I haven't kept a close eye on it until the news broke, but I was listening to financial experts talk about the fact that there have been bosses in and out of the company over the last 2 years, you know, having a 3-month tenure, then they're out, and all of them seem to be getting these golden goodbyes, which obviously doesn't sit well. To be fair on the political move, obviously it was a massive bone of contention between the Prime Minister and Jeremy Corbyn in PMQs today, but equally I think the Insolvency Service had already moved in to halt the bonuses anyway. It's just the news of that has broken today alongside the questions being asked of Mrs May of, you know, whether there's some culpability on the government's behalf or whether this indeed them remaining in place and having these payments being paid to them as thousands of workers are worried about not only their jobs but also their pensions. That's the bigger issue here. I mean, drop in the ocean compared to what is the deficit of the pension fund? 560 million or something?
And on that issue of culpability or not of the government, obviously Jeremy Corbyn was going in hard, accusing the government of negligence and pointing out that these contracts were still awarded after profits warnings last summer. Theresa May used an interesting word, didn't she? She described the government as being merely a customer rather than a manager involved in the business. I mean, how is this playing out for the government, would you say?
I mean, it's very, very bad for the government, but it's absolutely true, as you pointed out today, that a third of these were made by Labour. And this has been a tendency throughout of Labour government, new Labour, really. So actually, Corbyn is quite distinct from this, of course, because he would not have passed any of these contracts. But nevertheless, former Labour government had the record, absolutely the coalition had the record, and so did the Conservatives. This goes across this approach towards delivering of public services through outsourcing provision. However, that doesn't really change the fact that you're the person that stood there when the buck stops. And when you start looking at what happens here and the repercussions of what happens here, it can become quite toxic for the government very, very quickly. Because, of course, the next step is that we start discussing how much are local councils, are schools going to start spending by bringing the staff that would have been employed by the firm in-house. Now, that's a massive extra expenditure when you already have austerity stretching those budgets about as far as they can go. You have exactly the same thing going on across the areas that this company has been operating. That can be actually rather difficult when it comes to the way that local councils do, and it will be the government that will be ultimately blamed for it.
But I think the punters will see it, or people who are actually affected, will find it a bit insulting for it to have been used as a political football it has between Corbyn and the Conservatives, simply because, A, as you said, a third of the contracts are awarded under Labour, a third under the coalition and a third under the Tories. Theresa May cites the example that in recent weeks, Leeds City Council, which is Labour-run, picked Karelian for one of its own contracts. So I think the public thinks, well, you're all as bad as each other. What's actually the solution here, as people are wondering whether they're going to be able to put food on the table in the coming weeks?
My only hesitation on that is whether the public sees Corbyn as having continuity with the former Labour government. And because he is seen as this really quite distinct, especially economically, quite socialist-minded guy that hates this kind of idea, I don't know whether they will blame him in the way that they would have, for instance, if it was still Ed Miliband or someone who was quite associated with
I don't know. I think possibly that Jeremy Corbyn, with a self-reported halo, will tower above this on some kind of moral level. But I think people associate Labour with PFI as much as they have Conservatives in recent times.
Bring in the Times' take on PFI as well, because it's their lead, isn't it? And they're talking about billions being lost by taxpayers on wasteful PFI projects. This has come from the government spending watchdog, hasn't it?
Well, this is the other thing about public perception. While there's always been debate over Corbyn and McDonnell's approach, you know, basically saying that everything should be renationalised, and people are like, whoa, that's a bit too much. There are, however, a great many people out there who may look at their hospitals, or let's use the example of schools, and sort of think, well, why are schools contracting out school dinners? Why don't old-fashioned dinner ladies employed by the school make the school meals? Why is it that we've got cleaners contracted into hospitals when in the old days, I think at the time, my dad was a GP, so he told me nurses used to officiate what was cleaned and how it was cleaned and was in charge of that staff. So the notion of contracting out, I think there's a public perception around that it's wasteful and unnecessary, perhaps. I mean, I'm probably generalising. And this is suggesting that it actually is wasteful because it's probably more expensive to do it this way rather than manage it in-house.
And Jeremy Corbyn talked about this whole Karelian collapse being a watershed moment. I mean, to some extent, do you think he's right in that the whole way that government contracts are awarded in future will be looked at again? Yeah,
there's now a bigger conversation happening about what do we do about public service provision, and is it actually sensible to put it out to the private sector? There's never been that much evidence that it is a much more efficient way of doing things. There's been, I think, quite an ideological idea that's been around really since Thatcher and definitely continued by New Labour, which is the idea that the private sector is always more efficient, always does things better. The trouble is, these are not real markets. So, you know, when they privatise something like British Airways, the thing was you could give your money to another airliner, but here, the money will always flow because the product always has to be delivered and no one else can do it. So as we say, when we say that, you know, something's collapsing, the hospital still needs to get cleaned. So regardless of whether this company is going to provide it, if it's not them, the taxpayer is going to step in and it's going to have to do it. It is not like any other market. So these false markets that have been created have created quite perverse incentives, really. And when we look deeper and deeper into how this stuff operates, and these contracts go on for a very long time, punishing for the taxpayer, actually people are starting to lose their faith in them. So it could be a sea change.
Possibly as well, I was going to add that there's some public mistrust of the tendering process. Why does Karelian keep on getting job and job and job? It seems like jobs for the boys. Oh, well, they've done this, that and the other, so they must then automatically do X, Y and Z. I think there's also some mistrust of that. It all seems a bit cosy, the same companies continuing to get these contracts as opposed to a wider field. That may be because they've got a bigger capacity, but as we've seen, you know, they've bitten off more than they can chew, to put it bluntly.
Let's move on to another issue which is being talked about a lot in the papers because President Macron is on his way to the UK for a visit. And so let's take a look at the front page of The Telegraph because one thing that's coming out ahead of that meeting is the cost of policing the border at Calais and the dispute over whose responsibility that is, stopping migrants coming into the UK.
Well, you could have a hard stance on it, as some of the Brexiteers, I think, have been arguing, who also argue that we shouldn't necessarily be paying anything in a divorce bill, who will say, well, why is this Britain's problem? This is France's problem. A, they need to be paying for their own borders and their own police protection in the migrant situation. And second of all, why can't they derive this cash to further protect their borders from the 38 billion that we've offered as part of a severance payment in the transition period? On the other hand, Brexiteers could also argue that this is what Remainers said could not be achieved, that would have huge problems once we leave with this whole Calais border issue. And actually, she's being magnanimous by offering a fair wedge of cash to try and help...
the 44 million to
try and help solve a mutual problem.
I mean, it would be, just on a pure strategic level, forget any of the morality, it would be crazy not to give the money. Compared to the kind of sums that we talk about when we talk about Brexit, 44 million is nothing, really. So if you can keep a colleague on side when it comes to Brexit talks, someone that you're going to have a close relationship with in future, you would obviously pay this money for a problem that, frankly, the two countries do share. So, I mean, it seems to have gone quite well. Then Macron is quite famous for these charm offences that he has. Of course, today started with all the stuff about the Bayeux Tapestry being brought over here, although
In 5 years' time.
Well, yeah, but also, I mean, when the French leader comes over with depictions of the last time the French killed us over and over again, I'm surprised that we consider this some beautiful gift that he's given us. But
let's quickly turn to the Express page 5 as well, because it's still covering the area that you're talking about, but we haven't got very long, and you did want to also mention the Juncker's love-in element of this whole story.
Yes, well, echoing Tusk in the week, basically, I think Tusk had said, our hearts are still open for you, and Juncker is saying, if we have a change of heart, again, heaps of criticism going to be put on his shoulders, saying, what don't you get about the referendum result? I love this introspection now. Unfortunately, there wasn't introspection when we were threatening to leave. The love wasn't shown when David Cameron went over there and tried to get a reform deal. It's all very well now coming out with this effusive sort of overtures. Doesn't seem to help much in the negotiations when you've still got Barnier saying things like, oh, well, we can't include services in any deal. That's how much Brussels loves us.
I don't know about that. What we're seeing for this early stages when we start looking at the debate over transition, which is starting now, is that Britain has almost no leverage and is really up against the wall, which is part of the reason why many, many new demands are being made of it. The EU holds a much stronger situation over Britain in how we move. And yet there is still enough generosity there to start saying, if you want to change your mind, the option is open there. Now, that's important, and it is also profoundly upsetting, I think, to Brexiters back home, because it says that very important truth, which is that any moment up to March 2019, Britain can still change its mind if it doesn't like the look of that deal. That's strategically very important. It's politically very important as well.
Britain could change its mind and rejoin an EU that is completely different to the one that they were saying they were voting to stay in. So people who voted to maintain a status quo now want to rejoin an EU under Juncker's ultra-federalised plan. Is that what you're saying? That's what people want to rejoin?
Can you answer quickly, because we ought to go to a break?
I have no idea what people want or don't want, but it is very important that they know they have the choice.
But they don't have the choice,
I mean,
because we've had the result. It's all very well these people saying
but, I mean,
it doesn't make any difference.
You can change your mind if you wish to, which means by virtue of the fact that he's saying it, that you do have the choice.
Brilliant, but people think that we should honour the vote that we had.
We'll take a break, shall we?
Thank you.
OK, we're going to take a break. Are good manners a thing of the past? Please do join us after the break. Thank you so much. Welcome back. You're watching the press preview with me tonight, Ian Dunt and Camilla Tominey. And we're going to turn our attention to the front of The Guardian, which I'm still trying to remember that it's a tabloid and it looks different. There it is. Down at the bottom, though, is an exclusive story, as they've billed it there, talking about the bill for changing the cladding, or removing the cladding at the very least, from flats. Presumably this is in the wake of the Grenfell Tower disaster.
Precisely. It's a great but very scary story, that residents of this particular block of flats, which is owned by a freehold company, which is in turn owned by a multi-millionaire, have been told that they might face a bill of up to £31,000 per flat to have the cladding removed. Quite how on earth the freeholder can get away with issuing this arbitrary bill, goodness only knows. I don't think legally they probably can, but how horrifying for the tenants of such properties who presumably weren't necessarily consulted when the cladding went up, are now deemed liable for when it comes down. I would imagine that freeholders are vicariously responsible for anyone living in that block of flats to be safe, and therefore couldn't get away with giving them a bill of this sort.
We're talking a lot of money, aren't we?
We're talking about 30 grand a flat. Which just seems like an impossible amount of money to suddenly throw on a tenant. And we presume, I mean, look, we're not sure, the story's just come in, that there are legal protections against that. It's also, one presumes that the landlord has a legal obligation to provide a safe flat. And if it has been decided that the material that has been used around and in the flat is not safe, that seems to be their legal concern. But we're speaking rather on the hoof, because the story has just come in.
Yeah.
It's a very interesting story. And my guess is, just a hunch, is that there are plenty of landlords who are going to try and farm out as much of the cost of this stuff.
Yeah.
On the assumption that it won't be on the front page of a newspaper.
It's saying also fire wardens are patrolling constantly at a cost of £4 a week, which the company is also planning to pass on to the tenants.
Right. And so, interesting to see some of the inside pages on that, the continuation, for more details. But in the meantime, let's whiz on to the front page of The Express. They've got an intriguing headline. You'll have to explain it to me. Ban the NHS nosy park?
Yeah, I mean, the Express is very upset that the NHS is asking people about their sexuality, which apparently is this incredibly intrusive question that is being asked of people, but in fact goes, are you gay or straight or something else? So, which seems a completely normal thing, of course, to have to ask to make sure that you're targeting your services at people in various ways, very, very sensible, but is presented here as some kind of weird curtain-twitching fascination.
Hang on a minute.
You're going to defend your sister paper, I know.
First of all, the Express isn't upset about it. A royal doctor called Michael Dixon, a GP for 35 years and a medical advisor to Prince Charles, has written a piece in the BMJ talking about the new equality rules being political correctness gone mad, right? It's not the Express saying, it's the Express reporting somebody who's cross about it. So let's not shoot the messenger, point one. Point two, there are people of a certain generation that if they go in with an ear infection or a sore throat, might think it's a bit odd to be asked, are you homosexual? I've got no personal issue with being asked that necessarily, but I don't have any grandparents alive, but an 87-year-old neighbour might find that question, firstly, intrusive, and B, totally irrelevant. Is it relevant to a throat infection?
The first thing is, I never get this thing with the paper as just, oh, they're just the messenger. They have absolutely no interest.
It's not the Express saying it says royal doctor says colon.
Obviously
stop
the case
snooping
that
on
the Express's
patients' sex lives.
sympathies are with the doctor by some distance.
I think the Express might think its readers' sympathies are with the doctor.
Pick one, exactly the same result follows. But nevertheless, at the end of it, to be asked to fill in a form where you go heterosexual, gay, lesbian, or other, I'm sorry, just isn't the most intrusive thing. And if someone is so sensitive as to be offended by it, they're going to really struggle to get through the rest of their life as well as that meeting.
Well, they might have got through a lot of their life already and think that that's one question too many. You might not find it intrusive.
No, I don't, no.
But you're not an elderly person who might find that a little too personal.
We can't base all of the world on the most sensitive people in it. If
well,
it is,
they are a growing...
target services for various groups and that can help save lives
we
or help
can't
people,
base all of the world on the most sensible person. At a time when, at the moment, you can't literally say anything without the most sensible people on earth on Twitter condemning you for it.
Well, that's fine.
Well, unfortunately,
we shouldn't make any leeway for them, and we shouldn't make any leeway for these people because they can't handle to be asked.
with our sensibilities.
I'm saying the exact same both ways. We shouldn't be sensitive towards people on Twitter, and we shouldn't be so sensitive that people can't handle being asked whether they're heterosexual or not, which is a profoundly silly
Why is heterosexual or homosexual relevant to a throat infection?
It's very bad manners, I know, but I'm going to interrupt.
And talk about manners.
We are. Excellent. See what I did there? This is inside the Express, same paper, talking about good manners being shown the door. Are we getting ruder?
You can't say ladies first anymore because very sensitive people might object to it.
Can't you? I mean, you can say whatever you like, but
no, but you might be hashtagged if you do that.
According to a survey on Sky Atlantic, which of course, must have very, very good standards of survey making. I'm absolutely certain of it. We are becoming more and more rude. So this is the, not using your phone at the table and saying please and thank you. It certainly seems to me that things like not having a phone conversation at the table is going away. And actually, that is rather sad that people have their phone and seem very, very ready to use it when they should be talking to the person that they're with. On other parts, I don't know about you guys, but when I'm on public transport, I see people giving up their seats all the time, and it just doesn't seem to me that it is fading away.
We haven't got very much time, but very briefly.
I do see all that, but I do think that generally society is a bit more aggressive these days, and there's also quite a lot of pushing and shoving on public transport, and only this week I witnessed a quite unnecessary fight about a seat, so...
OK, we must leave it there. Thank you both very much indeed. I feel really under pressure to have good manners now. Very nice to see you. You'll be back at 11:30.
Thank you very much.
Hello there, you're watching the Press Preview, our first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. Over the next half an hour, we're going to be talking about the headlines with the editor of politics.co.uk, Ian Dunt, and the political editor of the Sunday Express, Camilla Tominey. So hello to both of you.
Hello.
Hello.
So let's take a look then at those front pages. And according to the Daily Telegraph, Theresa May has agreed to pay £44 million to help pay for French police to maintain the border at the Channel ports. The Mail's headline is Le Stitch Up, its opinion of the deal involving that £45 million, as they call it, the Bayeux Tapestry and a local French mayor. The Daily Star says that the death of former international footballer Gary Speed has been linked to possible sex abuse. The Eye leads on claims a nasty surprise is in store for the pensions of higher earners. The Times focuses on a warning from the government spending watchdog that billions of pounds extra are being spent on hospitals and schools because of private finance deals. And that story also makes the front of The Guardian, which reports that private finance initiative projects have cost taxpayers £200 billion. The Financial Times says one of the most important units of the worldwide financial group Goldman Sachs performed badly at the end of last year, dragging down the group's overall revenue. The Sun's front page is about an SAS veteran who's spoken to the newspaper about being left homeless despite having served his country in the Iranian embassy siege. And the front page of The Express calls to stop GPs asking intimate questions about people's sexual orientation. So let's talk about a selection of those stories with Dunt and Camilla Tominey. Not all of them, but we're certainly going to get to grips with quite a few of them. We're going to kick off with the Times front page because the collapse of Karelian has raised the whole debate over the value or the way in which public sector contracts are awarded, and their focus is on how much PFI projects are costing the taxpayer. Yeah,
it's National Audit Office who've been coming out with this, saying actually profoundly expensive, doesn't seem competitive, is not clear that it's saving us any money. I mean, there's very interesting stuff in what they're picking up, because of course 85% of the money that we're spending on this stuff now relates to things that were going on when Gordon Brown was either Prime Minister or in the Treasury. It gives you an impression of how this stuff operates. The way to think about a PFI project, which is different to sort of private provision of a public service, is that it's basically equivalent to like when you get your mobile phone. If you do those things where you're not paying for the phone and you're paying monthly, you know that you're going to end up paying for much more than the phone. But what's happening is it's being staggered and that cost is being shunted into the future. That's the same thing that's happening here. Is these guys, the private sector, they'll borrow the money, they'll build the hospital, you will start making repayments, the taxpayer starts making repayments, but those repayments are going to go on for an awfully long time and you're going to end up paying for much more than the value of the hospital. It shouldn't make any sense. Except that, of course, for each government, at the time that it's operating, it does make sense, because you get to build roads and build hospitals.
Without paying the full cost.
And there was no price involved. So Gordon Brown got to keep to all of his golden lines and all of, his clear economic rules. Everyone got to have their day-to-day bit if they wanted and shunt off the cost to the future. And now we're paying the penalty on that. Taken as a whole, it doesn't make sense. But taken day-to-day as a politician, it's a very, very attractive proposition indeed.
Yeah, although as far as the public's concerned, I think deep mistrust of PFI anyway. It's always been used as a political football, hasn't it, with Labour often citing PFI as an example of, conservative capitalism at its worst, and yet at the same time, they've been as involved, as you've pointed out, with Gordon Brown's tenure. Or at least New Labour has. I suppose old Labour will say that they want nothing to do with it. Second of all, it makes the point in this Times piece as well that a number of Whitehall departments have expressed concerns about exorbitant costs of commitments they simply can't get out of. And of course, that has then prompted them to bring in consultants to talk about reducing the costs, which is the kind of thing that's complete anathema to the voters. You're already paying too much money. You're trying to solve some sort of cash crisis by bringing in consultants on hundreds of thousands of pounds a year. Doesn't make any financial sense.
But given the context of the timing of this report from the National Audit Office, is it going to add fuel to the debate about the way in which contracts are awarded by the government? And is this a watershed moment? Are things going to change?
So the whole thing's being slowly prized open now. You get that sense. And this is often how news operates. You get 2 or 3 stories coming at the same time that start illuminating different areas of how something works. And this is, of course, at a time when we're anyway talking much more about privatisation, because there is a Labour leader things. And that has brought things up. Remember, for years, we would never talk about rail nationalisation or anything like that throughout any of the New Labour years and even afterwards. It's only really when Corbyn came in that became sayable again, it has to be said. And now that this stuff is being raised, there's a much bigger debate that's being had about the way that we conduct ourselves. And that comes, I think, from a breaking of a sort of what was ultimately quite an ideological instinct in the political class, which is that private sector was good and public sector was bad. Private sector was much more efficient, it could do things right, and the public sector wouldn't. And actually now that's been cracking, but the truth was there was never that much public support for it. You look at you look at Conservative members, you look at UKIP members, most of them were opposed to rail privatisation and remained opposed to view of this debate. And now I think that's starting to chisel away and we're starting to see facets of it. Too early to say whether it's a complete sea change, but certainly something interesting is happening in the debate.
Having said that, I was just going to say, a lot of PFI as a concept is getting a lot of the blame. Interestingly, though, I mean, Karelian had £2.6 billion worth of contract deals. It had everything in its favour. It was winning these tenders. It was having a huge influence over a lot of these government contracts, and yet still mismanaged it all. I mean, how terrible are these people? What were they playing at? I mean, let's put the blame at the door of the very many people that kept on coming into Karelian, trying to run it, extracting huge amounts in wages and bonuses, only to see it fail and then run off and leave it to the next person.
Government needs to take blame on oversight as well, though.
Yeah,
it's not just their responsibility.
I know, but let's not forget that the way Karelian has been managed, I mean, these people can't run a bath, can they?
Let's just bring in another newspaper while we carry on this discussion, because it is relevant. The Daily Express, Karelian bonuses stopped. So you talk about Theresa May was quite keen to push the pressure off the government onto the company as well, reminding people she described the government as a customer, she said, rather than managing it. In the meantime, we also heard that the bonuses of some of those directors, which had caused such controversy, were being stopped. Yeah,
indeed. And look, this is a very prime area to make political capital out of. Jeremy Corbyn was doing, a relatively good job of it in PMQs today, about as good as a job as he ever does at anything in PMQs, which frankly is not very good, but better than usual. So he was managing to get some political capital out of attacks on the amount they were remunerated. She had some defences. But ultimately, this money, as much as there is a sense of injustice there of people fearing about losing their jobs while people right at the top of management get all these payouts, is a drop in the ocean as to what is really going to get paid in the end. Because in the end, we have to run these services. Hospitals have to be cleaned. Prisons have to be managed. And this was the company that was doing that work. So those staff that have gone to Karelian are going to have to move back, and they're going to renegotiate their salary with union support, and they're going to be paid more. And local councils, which are already stretched, are going to really, really struggle with that. In other areas where other firms are going to come in to run the service, they know that they have the government up against the wall. So when they negotiate on how much they're going to charge for that, they are going to start charging them an awful lot. Whichever way you look at it, public finances are going to be squeezed as a result of this story.
Although these wages are symbolic of the notion that a lot of these companies are getting money for old rope. For instance, a number of interim chief executives who have successively left have left while still being paid salary and bonuses after they've left. Ordinary people in ordinary jobs don't have these kind of ridiculous benefits. So I appreciate it is a drop in the ocean, but for people who are wondering whether they're going to be in a job next week, why on earth should the people who have mismanaged this entire crisis leave with anything?
And the debate will continue about what role the government played and what they should and shouldn't do as well. But let's move on to another issue, which we will be talking about a lot again tomorrow, and the papers are highlighting the fact that President Macron is coming over from France. I think we can look at the page 1 of the Daily Mail. Their pithy little summing up of the situation. Le stitch-up, they call it. Should have my French accent. Hope you noticed that. So, various deals are being announced. We've heard about the Bayeux. We heard about that today, though it won't happen for a few years. But tell us a little bit about the other areas that the Mail is referring to.
Yeah, it's a good headline. The content isn't so great. So really, this is another 45 million payment that it seems that Theresa May has agreed to make towards Macron, which is really about this constant problem that we have at Dover Calais, of people coming in, many of them trying to get to Britain. There are a variety of reasons for this. I mean, a lot of them were people that have actually been brought up in Britain, who actually had their refugee status taken away when they were 18 and chucked out, and their way back into the country is often through France. But there's other reasons that people try to get here rather than being in France. This problem is really a shared French-British problem, and they're looking for a bit more money to keep it going. Now, quite apart from the morality or the actual strategic importance of it on the ground, what is, of course, important is that Theresa May knows that she has another round of negotiations that are coming up. European partners are discussing right now how they're going to be talking about the future Brexit deal that Britain secures. Those meetings are going on in Brussels at the moment. She will be very, very keen to make sure that Macron is, if not an ally, at least not absolutely hostile to what she's trying to do. And I imagine that some of that thinking went into why this payment is being made.
Although, let's point out, what's wrong with the content of this?
The idea that it's a stitch-up. It's not a stitch-up.
Well, or you could say that we've already paid the French, I think, 167 million quid, and that Macron or others, in saying that, it's basically blackmail, isn't it? We're not going to honour the 2K agreement, even though it was a mutually signed agreement. It's blackmail, and it's going back for more and more money.
That seems a very emotive word to use for what's going on there.
Well, no, I'm not saying I say that. I'm saying this is the claim, like Charlie Elphicke, who's the Tory MP for Dover, is saying, look, we've already paid them nearly 170 million quid. How much more money do they want, you know? And equally, you're saying, well, she has to butter up Macron. I would imagine Macron, like Merkel in Germany, is not necessarily needing that much buttering up when they could be facing the prospect of having to fill our contributions for years to come and losing huge pots of money
Well, they
that we're
have to do
offering
that
in divorce bills. Well, exactly.
I'm gonna
So they're
bring
not
in-
quite as...
We have very little leverage over them. If you start losing the leverage that you have, you already have a very significant issue.
We have huge leverage over them.
What leverage do we have?
We have leverage over them in terms of the fact that Germany is going to be saddled with an enormous amount of money.
So that is already happening. It's not leverage.
And
it's
other
simply
member
a penalty
states
that puts them at odds with us.
Well, they have leverage in the fact that while there may have been consensus over trying to get as much money out of us as possible for the divorce bill, they've already got the Dutch, Hungary, Ireland, Spain and Italy all clamouring for a comprehensive free trade deal. Germany might want to block that to punish us and make us less competitive, but unfortunately they're coming under pressure from their own member states, all of whom have electorates that aren't all waving the EU flag and saying the European project's a brilliant thing.
I'm sorry to say that
That's
the
a lot of
analysis is
projects.
deeply flawed. Those countries are not gravitating very, very hard for a trade deal. In every single case, they pay more attention to maintaining the integrity of the single market than they do towards rewarding us for our actions. It's true that all of them would benefit by having a decent deal, but that does not mean, when you take them cumulatively, that it would end up with them giving us leverage. Now, it has to be said that analysis is very, very flawed, and it is certainly not the way that negotiations have progressed until now.
OK,
It's not the way they'll progress for the
come
next
back at
6
that
months.
quickly, because we ought to go to a break.
Well, you can say it's flawed because you're on the other side of the argument. You could equally argue that actually, if you went along with the so-called hard Brexit, in other words, Brexit argument that actually you leave on WTO, we've traded with other countries on it. If we trade with other countries at less price, then we're going to be more competitive anyway. It's a big threat to the EU. It's a strange argument, this whole argument that Britain can't get a good deal because if they do, then everyone wants to leave. Well, that's then suggesting that the EU and membership of it isn't that great a thing after all.
There's no country in the world that trades with Europe exclusively on WTO terms, just to be clear.
Yeah,
That's
but
very
the truth of the lie is, why are you worried about us getting a good deal if it's going to encourage other people to have a Brexit or Italy?
Guys, I'm going to have to encourage you to continue this during the break, because we really must go to one. Apologies for cutting you off. Plenty more to talk about after the break, including why Prince Charles is facing criticism for praising homeopathy. We'll explain that in a moment. Welcome back. You're watching the press preview. With me tonight, Ian Dunt and Camilla Tominey, and we're going to turn our attention to Donald Trump. Rarely a press preview goes by without some mention of him. Here he is inside the Times. His alleged comment, rude word that he used about countries in Africa and South America, apparently, which he denies, apparently is threatening to block the...
We're going to do all of this analysis without mentioning the words that he uses. Exactly,
That's
the word
your
does not
challenge.
exist. Exactly, yes, indeed, it's taboo. OK, so look, I mean, he made this comment. Apparently, it works very, very well with his base. The comment is considered to be very derogatory towards countries like Haiti and also towards African states. Now, he now has a problem because Congress wants to pass a spending bill and it needs to do it by Friday. If it doesn't do it by Friday evening, then many of his projects, including that famous border wall that he wants to build, are going to be caught up. And it seems like that comment has rather put a rupture where they thought that there could be some work between Democrats and Republicans. Up until this point, Democrats had something that they wanted and they thought they could get from him, which is a legal status for these guys called dreamers, who are basically immigrants in the US. Very, very uncertain status. They thought they could secure it in exchange for signing up to the spending plans. Now, the very emotive issue has upset an awful lot of people by using this kind of language. It looks like that might be in rather more trouble than he'd originally anticipated. So we could have a replay of that time, as we did with Obama, where everything goes right up to midnight. The spending plan could fall through altogether.
Although, sorry, apologies. I was just going to say he has denied he said it. He admits he used tough language, but he says he didn't use that word. Is that going to cut any ice, do you think?
Probably not, no. Because it's already had the traction required to cause a massive ruckus anyway. And equally, his status as a deal maker, you know, a businessman, an entrepreneur who knows money and is, you know, a stable genius and all the rest of it, is slightly compromised in the fact that he does have the House and he does have the Senate. So if there's a government lockdown, it will just make him look absolutely ridiculous. I note with this story as well, in what world are we living in that there is what would do a bullet on the end of the story, simply saying, oh, by the way, while we're talking about Trump, a porn actress has claimed that Mr. Trump slept with her in 2006 when his wife had just been given birth to their son. Point being, if this was any other president in history, I would suggest that perhaps wouldn't just be an add-on to another story on page 30. It might be a front page. But with Trump, it's all been so diluted, all of these claims, that it just becomes an finally little bullet point.
Denials all round, of
Denials
course.
Absolutely. It does go to show that, of course, that volatile language that he uses, which makes him so compelling and that leads to the fact that he's on here every night, also has concrete political ramifications in terms of the passing of legislation, passing of deals, because regardless of what we think of its actual core meaning, it upsets people, and people that are upset tend not to want to cooperate with you when it matters.
OK, let's move on to a story that you spotted inside the Mail. And this is about a translator from Afghanistan, isn't it? And a discussion over the treatment of them.
Yeah, exactly. It's a translator who was working with British forces, has now been denied asylum in this country on the basis that he was working in the wrong area. There is a scheme, an MOD scheme, that means that they're allowed to come over because, of course, they face considerable threats back in Afghanistan. The scheme, however, is only people who are working in Helmand. He was working in Kabul, and by virtue of that is being denied it. Now, he has lots of sort of top brass speaking out for him. He has, obviously, the Daily Mail speaking out for him at the same time. You know, a newspaper that's typically anti-immigration, when it does take on a pro-immigration story, it usually means that, you know, there may be some movement there. It's quite dispiriting when you see this sort of decision take place, when you think about it again, not thinking about the morality, but just thinking about the long-term strategic operations of the British Army. When you start allowing these stories to get out, you just discourage people from working in future operations with the British Army, because they think that if they're in trouble, they're not going to get any help and they're not going to be able to come over. It's tremendously short-sighted stuff. We can only hope that they change the decision.
I just question one thing in what you said. I'm not sure if the Daily Mail is anti-immigration or more anti-uncontrolled immigration.
OK, well, I would go with the former.
OK.
Shall we move on to our final story, which is inside the Mail that you've picked out? Prince Charles under fire for, in inverted commas, preaching homeopathy.
Yeah, I just picked this out because it keeps on coming up with regard to Prince Charles. To be fair, Boots the chemist has also been criticised for stocking homeopathy alongside conventional medicines. This has always stalked Prince Charles wherever he's gone. He always says, and this is the key distinction here, are we talking about alternative therapies and therefore doctors quite rightly criticise the suggestion perhaps that you could use leaves and tree bark and herbs to cure cancer versus it being used as a complementary therapy, which is how Prince Charles advocates it, saying that he thinks that these medicines should be used integrated with conventional treatments. It is one thing that the royalty has, of course, in common with Jeremy Corbyn.
It is.
Because he is pro-homeopathy.
He signed an EDM or something, didn't he? An early
Apparently
demotion,
so.
I think, in Parliament. Yeah, Jeremy Corbyn has a bit of a history with homeopathy, which is, of course, a great litmus test for whether someone's a raving lunatic. And it turns out that Prince Charles and Jeremy Corbyn arguably fall under that category, at least when it comes to homeopathy.
I see, I took arnica when I had a child, and I think it helps. The placebo effect, of course, can be quite strong, and therefore should we be criticising anything that might help people?
Oh, I don't know. It does if it's fraudulent and nonsensical, yes.
Let's leave it there. Camilla and Ian, good to see you as always. Thanks very much, Steve.
Thank you.